Do you remember exactly how it was? Or do you just think you remember? Think about it for a moment. A scene from your childhood flashes through your mind with rich detail. The place, the people, perhaps even a specific smell or sensation. For you, it's a clear memory, almost proof of what happened. But then someone in your family says, "That was never like that," or worse, "That never happened." At that moment, something uncomfortable happens inside your head. Doubt appears. And the inevitable question arises, is this memory real, or was it created by your imagination? This type of situation is more common than it seems. We all carry memories that we swear are true, but that no one else confirms. Stories that we remember with absolute conviction, as if they were faithful recordings of the past. But the human brain doesn't work like a camera. It doesn't record facts and store them intact. It reconstructs. It interprets. And often, it completes what is missing. Have you ever experienced this? The most intriguing thing is that when a memory surfaces in the mind, it comes with a feeling of certainty. It doesn't seem like imagination. It seems like a recollection. And that's precisely where the problem lies. The brain uses the same systems to remember and to imagine. The same brain areas that access the past are also activated when we create mental scenes, hypothetical scenarios, or stories that never happened. The result? An extremely thin line between memory and imagination. Perhaps you're thinking now, "But I feel like I remember this." And that feeling is real. The sensation of familiarity, of recognition, of "I've lived this before," is powerful. The brain associates this familiarity with truth. If something seems familiar, it assumes it's reliable. But that's an assumption, not a guarantee. What you're about to discover may surprise you. From an early age, we learn to trust memory as part of our identity. After all, we are made of our memories. They shape who we are, how we make decisions, and how we interpret the world. But we rarely stop to question how these memories are formed. Few people realize that every time we remember something, that memory is re-edited. It is not merely accessed, it is reconstructed, mixed with emotions, expectations, and information acquired after the original event. This is where imagination silently comes into play. When the brain encounters gaps, missing details, incomplete information, confusing moments, it prefers to fill them in rather than leave them blank. And it does so convincingly that you don't even notice. The result can be a distorted, exaggerated, or even completely false memory, but one that rings absolutely true to the person who experienced it internally. And don't think this only happens to distracted or confused people. This is a normal functioning of the human brain. An efficient mechanism for making sense of the world, but one that comes at a price. Our perception of the past is not always reliable. How many decisions have you made based on something you believed you remembered clearly? How many arguments have arisen because two people remembered the same situation in completely different ways? Stay with me until the end of this video because understanding why the brain confuses memory with imagination completely changes how you see your own memories. As we go along, you'll realize that what seems so solid in your mind can be much more flexible and fragile than you imagine. And from here, the question stops being "What do I remember?" and becomes, "How did my brain construct this memory?" And if, while you're listening to all this, a specific memory comes to mind, pay attention to it now. It could be a small detail, an old scene, or even something recent that you've always recounted with absolute certainty. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far. It could be a memory you've started to question, a situation where two people remembered the same story in completely different ways, or simply the strange feeling of realizing that the past may not be as solid as it seemed. When you comment, you're not just sharing an experience, you're helping other people recognize themselves in it too. And if at any point you thought, "I'd never stop to look at memory this way," consider liking the video. It seems simple, but it makes a huge difference in getting this content to more people who also enjoy scientific curiosities, brain mysteries, and strange phenomena of the human mind. That's how this conversation continues. Now, if you're curious about how the brain creates these distortions, how it mixes memory with imagination, emotion with fact, and you want to continue exploring this kind of topic, subscribe to the channel. It's not just a button, it's a way of saying you want to keep investigating how the mind really works beyond the obvious. Your participation here is what keeps this space alive, growing, and reaching more people who, perhaps without realizing it, are also questioning their own memories. And from here, things get even more interesting. Because understanding that memory can fail is just the beginning. What really matters is discovering how, when, and why the brain does this, and what happens inside your mind at the exact moment when a memory seems too real to be questioned. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because there's a hidden truth here that completely changes how you understand your own mind. The biggest surprise happens when you realize that memory isn't a file stored somewhere in the brain, waiting to be accessed intact whenever you want. Memory is a living, active process constantly transforming. Every time you remember something, the brain doesn't open the original memory, it recreates that experience in the present with the resources it has now. This means that remembering is, in practice, a creative act. The brain takes fragments of the past, mixes them with current emotions, beliefs, expectations, and even information you acquired after that event. The result is a reconstructed version of the story, not a faithful copy. And the most impressive thing is that this reconstruction happens without you realizing it. To your consciousness, the sensation is the same as always: clarity, familiarity, certainty. But behind this sensation, there is an invisible work happening in the background of the mind. When you recall an old scene, the brain activates networks linked to imagination in the same way it would if you were creating a new scenario. Visualization, emotion, narrative, all of this comes into play. That's why some memories seem to gain detail over time instead of fading. They aren't being reinforced, they're being reinterpreted. Each new memory is, in fact, a new version of that story. An updated edition. This has a profound impact on how you make decisions. Because if memory is a reconstruction, then many choices you believe to be based on solid facts may be supported by distorted versions of the past. Past experiences shape your mindset, influence how you react to people, how you trust, how you avoid, how you repeat patterns. And all of this may be underpinned by memories that aren't exactly as you think they are. The brain does this because it needs to make sense of the world. It hates uncertainty. It prefers a coherent story, even if imperfect, to an unexplained void. When information is missing, it fills in the gaps. When something doesn't fit, it adjusts. This mechanism is efficient for survival, but dangerous when we confuse coherence with absolute truth. Truth, often, is hidden behind a comfortable narrative. There is also a powerful emotional factor in this process. Emotions act as a filter that intensifies certain parts of the memory and erases others. Moments filled with fear, joy, shame, or guilt tend to seem more real than they actually were. Not because they happened that way, but because they were felt that way. The brain prioritizes emotional impact over factual accuracy. For it, what matters is not exactly what happened, but the meaning it had for you. This is where memory and imagination begin to truly merge. Imagination doesn't create from nothing. It rearranges elements that already exist within you. Sounds, images, words, emotions. When these pieces are rearranged during a recollection, the boundary between remembering and imagining practically disappears. And the most curious thing is that the more you revisit a memory, the more confident you feel in it, even if it's increasingly distant from the original event. This explains why two people can experience the same situation and have completely different memories. Each brain constructs its own narrative, based on personal filters, past experiences, and emotional states. There is no neutral file being accessed. There are interpretations, personal revelations, subjective truths that seem objective. Understanding this is part of an important inner journey. Not to distrust everything you remember, but to develop awareness. To realize that the mind is not an impartial judge of the past, but rather a narrator trying to keep the story of your life coherent. This perception can be transformative. It opens up space to review beliefs, reframe experiences, and even alleviate internal conflicts that arose from misinterpreted memories. When you accept that memory is reconstruction, something changes. You begin to look at the past with more curiosity and less rigidity. You begin to understand that certain pains may have been amplified, certain fears reinforced, certain certainties created unintentionally. This doesn't invalidate what you felt, but it broadens your understanding of how it was constructed within you. And the deeper you delve into this understanding, the more you realize that the human mind is less a vault and more a laboratory. A space of continuous experimentation, where past and imagination meet to shape who you are now. This is one of the quietest and most impactful revelations about how the brain works. If all of this resonated with you in any way, write a simple but sincere sentence in the comments. That makes sense to me. This small interaction already says a lot about the journey you're beginning here. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding how the brain constructs a memory reveals behind-the-scenes aspects that few people stop to observe, and when they do observe, they rarely see their own memory in the same way again. What you call a memory is not born complete, organized, or faithful. It begins fragmented, scattered, incomplete. The moment something happens, the brain doesn't register the experience as a continuous whole. It collects parts. One part of the brain deals with images. Another registers sounds. Another captures physical sensations. There are areas dedicated to the emotions aroused at that moment and others responsible for assigning meaning to what is happening. Each element goes to a different place, like scattered pieces of a puzzle that does not yet exist as a final image. In that initial instant, there is no memory, there are only raw fragments of experience. It's only later, when you try to remember what happened, that the brain kicks in like a true narrative assembler. It needs to gather these loose pieces and create something coherent, understandable, that makes sense within your personal history. The problem is that this puzzle is rarely complete. There are always missing details, connections, context. And the brain doesn't deal well with gaps. It prefers to fill in the gaps rather than admit absence. When a piece is missing, the brain doesn't interrupt the process. It fills in the gaps with whatever is available at that moment. Current emotions, beliefs formed later, similar experiences, expectations, interpretations. The result is a functional, convincing, and emotionally consistent memory, but not necessarily faithful to what actually happened. This reconstruction happens behind the scenes without asking permission from consciousness. Therefore, every time you remember something, the memory changes a little. Not because you are ruining the memory, but because the brain is reconstructing that experience with the resources of the present. The past is reinterpreted in the light of the now. Current emotions color old emotions. Information acquired later alters previous meanings. What you call memory is, in practice, an updated version of history. This process has a profound impact on how you construct your mindset. Memories don't just tell what happened. They explain who you are. They justify decisions, support beliefs, and reinforce behavioral patterns. When the brain reconstructs a memory, it also reinforces an internal narrative about who you were, who you are, and why you act the way you do. Memory becomes a pillar of identity. But there's an important detail in this construction. The brain doesn't prioritize precision. It prioritizes meaning. What matters isn't whether the sound was exactly that or if the phrase was said with those words. What matters is the emotional impact, the interpretation, the feeling left behind. Memory is organized more around meaning than the accuracy of facts. Factual truth often takes a back seat. Emotions play a central role in this process. They act as a powerful glue between fragments that don't always belong to the same moment. An intense emotion can evoke similar images, sounds, and meanings, even if they didn't occur together. The brain associates all of this and delivers a memory that seems extremely real, rich in detail, and full of conviction. But this richness can be constructed, not remembered. That's why some memories seem to gain more detail over time instead of fading. A look becomes more striking. A phrase seems clearer. A scene takes on more defined contours. This doesn't mean the memory is becoming more precise. It means the brain is refining the narrative so that it continues to make sense within your personal journey. All of this happens silently. For you, the memory simply arises. It comes accompanied by familiarity, recognition, certainty. And the brain interprets this familiarity as a sign of truth. Something sounds familiar, it assumes it's reliable. This mental shortcut influences judgments, decisions, and even conflicts because it creates the feeling that, I know it was like this. This dynamic helps explain why two people can experience the same situation and retain completely different memories. Each brain constructs its own puzzle, using different pieces, distinct emotional filters, and unique personal meanings. There is no neutral access to the past. There are interpretations, internal narratives, subjective truths that seem objective. When you begin to understand this, something transforms in the way you look at your own memories. A space of awareness emerges. A healthy detachment. You realize that some certainties may have been built on incomplete pieces. That certain pains may have been amplified by the way they were reinterpreted. That some convictions may not be records but versions. This perception doesn't weaken the human experience. On the contrary, it expands it. It allows for internal revisions, reinterpretations, and more conscious choices. Because if memories influence decisions, understanding how they are constructed changes the way you act in the present. The journey ceases to be automatic and becomes something to be observed. The deeper you delve into this understanding, the clearer it becomes that the human mind is not a vault that holds facts, but an active laboratory for constructing meaning. A space where fragments of the past are constantly rearranged to sustain the continuity of experience. Stories that seem solid, but which were assembled piece by piece over time, based on what was available at each moment. And when you realize this, a natural curiosity begins to arise. If the brain already fills in small gaps in this way, what happens when the gaps are larger? What does it do when there are almost not enough pieces to complete the puzzle? It is precisely at this point that things become even more intriguing. If this understanding resonates with you, leave a comment below, I'm on this journey too. This simple sentence already says a lot about the impact of this deeper look at memory. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this is where one of the brain's quietest and most powerful gears comes into play. There's something the human mind simply doesn't tolerate well: emptiness. The absence of meaning, the lack of explanation, the blank space. For the brain, saying "I don't know" isn't comfortable. It's unstable. It's a threat to the coherence of the internal narrative. And that's precisely why imagination plays such a decisive role in the functioning of memory. When the brain tries to reconstruct a memory and realizes that pieces are missing, it doesn't pause the process waiting for more precise information. It doesn't leave the story incomplete. It activates an automatic filling-in mechanism. Imagination comes into play as a functional resource, not as conscious fantasy. It acts behind the scenes, connecting fragments, creating transitions, inventing plausible details so that the story continues to make sense. This filling in doesn't happen randomly. The brain uses everything that's available: similar experiences, associated emotions, already known patterns, personal beliefs, expectations about how things should have been. Imagination in this context doesn't create something absurd. It creates something coherent. Something that fits your current mindset and the narrative you've built about yourself throughout your life. It's important to understand that this process isn't a brain error. It's a strategy. An efficient way to maintain continuity, identity, and predictability. The problem arises when this efficiency is confused with absolute truth. Because the invented detail doesn't come with a label saying, "This was imagined." It comes glued to the memory, mixed with emotion, integrated into the recollection as if it had always been there. This is how extremely vivid memories arise of things that may never have happened that way, or that never happened at all. Imagination works like an automatic filler, adjusting the story so that it has no visible flaws. And the more times you access that memory, the more solid that filling becomes. The imagined version becomes the remembered version. The brain prefers an imperfect explanation to no explanation at all. It prefers an invented detail to a blank space. Because emptiness generates discomfort, insecurity, instability. In terms of survival, not knowing is dangerous. So the mind learns from an early age to create meaning even when there is not enough data. This ability was essential for human evolution, but it exacts a price in how we deal with the past. This mechanism has a profound impact on how we interpret emotional experiences. When something has been confusing, ambiguous, or emotionally intense, the brain tends to fill in the gaps even more strongly. Emotions amplify the imagination. Fear adds threats. Nostalgia adds beauty. Guilt adds weight. Imagination doesn't just complete the memory, it colors it. Over time, these colors begin to seem original. You don't feel like you're imagining them. You feel like you're remembering them. And this sense of authenticity is what makes it all so convincing. The mind doesn't clearly differentiate between a reconstructed memory and an accurate one. Both produce the same subjective feeling of certainty. And this certainty influences decisions, behaviors, judgments, and even entire relationships. How many times have you made an important decision based on something you always believed had happened? How many times have you reacted emotionally to a current situation because an old memory was triggered, even if that memory was incomplete or distorted? Imagination, when combined with memory, is not restricted to the past. It shapes the present. This is one of the most overlooked aspects of the human mind: how internal narratives are maintained not through accuracy but through coherence. The brain functions like an editor, preferring a flowing narrative to a truthful one if necessary. And this choice happens automatically, without conscious consultation. Upon realizing this, something begins to shift in how you perceive your own history. You start to understand that certain convictions may have been reinforced not because they were entirely true, but because they were necessary to keep the narrative afloat. This doesn't invalidate what you felt, but it reveals that there is a difference between feeling and remembering accurately. This realization can be profoundly transformative. It opens up space to revisit memories without fear, to question old certainties, to alleviate internal conflicts that may have been sustained by unintentionally invented details. Imagination, in this sense, ceases to be an enemy and becomes understood as a powerful tool, one that needs to be recognized so as not to operate in the dark. The more you observe this process, the more you realize that the mind is constantly trying to protect the continuity of your journey. It doesn't want gaps in the story. It doesn't want ruptures. It wants meaning. Even if, to achieve that, it needs to create it. And when you begin to see this clearly, an inevitable question arises: to what extent was what you remember actually lived? And to what extent was it constructed to fill in what was missing? This is where the curiosity truly deepens, because understanding the role of imagination in filling in the gaps leads to an even greater revelation about confidence, perception, and inner reality. If this understanding makes sense to you, write in the comments, "That makes sense to me." This simple sentence already shows that something important is being reorganized inside. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a silent ingredient that runs through everything we've talked about so far and often goes unnoticed: emotion. It doesn't just accompany memory, it shapes memory. And the more intense the emotion involved in an experience, the greater the feeling that that memory is true, solid, and indisputable, even when it's deeply distorted. The human brain doesn't process all experiences the same way. It prioritizes what generates emotional impact. Neutral moments tend to dissipate over time, while experiences filled with fear, joy, shame, guilt, or euphoria leave much stronger marks. Not because they were recorded more accurately, but because they activated brain systems that amplify the feeling of importance. Emotion acts as a marker saying, "This matters." When an intense emotion is present, the brain releases substances that increase focus, attention, and retention of that experience. This creates the illusion that the memory is more accurate. But, in practice, what becomes stronger is not the factual detail, it's the subjective experience. What you remember clearly is not exactly what happened but how you felt at that moment. And the brain once again confuses intensity with truth. This is one of the most intriguing behind-the-scenes aspects of the mind. Emotions make memories more vivid, more accessible, more convincing. They give color, depth, and weight to the memory. But this vividness doesn't guarantee accuracy. On the contrary, the greater the emotional charge, the greater the chance of distortion. The brain begins to reorganize the facts so that they make sense with the emotion felt, and not necessarily with objective reality. Think of a memory associated with fear. Over time, threatening details tend to grow. A look becomes more aggressive. A tone of voice seems harsher. An environment seems more hostile than it actually was. The brain adjusts the narrative to justify the experienced emotion. The same happens with happy memories. Positive moments are often idealized, softened, embellished. Emotion pulls the memory toward a version that matches the feeling. This is where many certainties become solidified. The person not only remembers, they feel that they remember. And this feeling of conviction is extremely persuasive. For the brain, if something is accompanied by a strong emotion, it gains the status of truth. Questioning this memory begins to generate discomfort, because it doesn't seem like just a factual doubt, but a threat to something that was deeply felt. This dynamic directly influences decisions throughout life. How many choices are made based on past experiences that carry an intense emotional charge? How many automatic reactions arise because an emotional memory was activated, even if the current context is different? Emotion speeds up decisions while reason tries to keep up later. And when emotional memory comes into play, it usually speaks louder. The brain learns quickly from emotions. It creates shortcuts. If something from the past was painful, it tries to avoid any situation that even remotely resembles it. If something was pleasurable, it seeks to repeat it. The problem is that these comparisons are made based on reconstructed and emotionally amplified memories. The mind reacts not to what happened, but to the emotional meaning that was recorded. This mechanism has a profound impact on how you perceive people, situations, and even yourself. An emotionally significant experience can become a permanent filter. Everything passes through it. Memory ceases to be just a recollection and transforms into a lens. And the more times this lens is used, the stronger it becomes. Emotion reinforces the narrative, and the narrative reinforces the emotion, creating a cycle that is difficult to perceive. The most curious thing is that, even when an emotional memory is distorted, it continues to be felt as absolutely real. The body reacts. The heart races. Tension appears. The sensation is authentic. And this makes the brain interpret, "If I feel this, then it must be true." The emotion validates the memory regardless of the accuracy of the facts. This is one of the great paradoxes of the human mind. Emotion is essential for giving meaning to life, but it is also one of the main factors in the confusion between memory and imagination. It doesn't lie on purpose, but reorganizes everything to maintain internal coherence. The brain doesn't ask if the story is accurate, it asks if it makes emotional sense. When you begin to understand how this works, something changes in your mindset. You start to observe your own reactions with more curiosity. You begin to question whether certain certainties come from facts or from old emotions that continue to echo. This awareness doesn't eliminate emotions, but it creates space for more conscious, less automatic choices. This inner journey is silent yet powerful. It reveals that many personal truths may actually be emotional truths, constructed, reinforced, and maintained over time. And recognizing this doesn't erase the past, but it changes how it influences the present. You stop being a hostage to emotional memories and become an observer of them. The deeper you delve into this understanding, the clearer it becomes that emotion doesn't just color memory, it can rewrite the entire experience. And when this rewriting happens repeatedly, the boundary between what was lived and what was felt becomes almost invisible. It is at this point that memory seems absolute even when it is not. And when you realize how much emotion interferes with the feeling of truth, the need naturally arises to look at another, even more delicate aspect of this process. What happens when the brain starts creating memories that never actually existed, but that seem as real as any other? If this reflection resonates with you, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. This simple sentence already shows that this conversation is provoking something beyond the surface. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because we've reached a point that often generates a certain internal discomfort. The idea that the brain can create entire memories of things that never happened. Not distorted details, not small flaws, but complete scenes with images, emotions, dialogues, and a sense of absolute reality. That's where false memories come in, one of the most intriguing and revealing phenomena about the workings of the human mind. Think of a story from your childhood that was always told in your family. Something you remember because you heard it so many times that the scene seems to be etched in your head. Perhaps a funny situation, an embarrassing episode, a trip, a fall, a memorable phrase said by someone. Now try to observe honestly, do you really remember it? Or do you remember the story being told? For the brain, this difference doesn't always exist. Stories repeated over the years have enormous power. Each time they are retold, they activate mental images, emotions, and meanings. The brain begins to fill in the gaps, adding visual details, bodily sensations, even feelings that may never have been experienced at that original moment. Over time, this narrative ceases to be just a story heard and becomes felt as a personal memory. False memory is born there, silently. What's most disturbing is that these memories seem as real as any other. There's no internal warning saying, "Warning, this was imagined." On the contrary, they come loaded with familiarity, emotion, and conviction. You can see the scene, feel the atmosphere, almost hear the voices. And the more times this memory is accessed, the more solid it becomes. The brain reinforces what is revisited, regardless of whether it actually happened or not. This process doesn't only happen within families. It happens in conversations, in old photos, in casual comments, and interpretations made later. A photo can become an entire memory. A comment can become an episode. Silence can be interpreted as rejection. The brain connects the dots and creates a coherent narrative, even when the original points were insufficient to support that story. This is one of the great workings of the mind, the ability to transform external information into internal experience. When you hear something repeatedly, the brain begins to treat it as part of your own journey. The line between living and imagining dissolves. And this generates an uncomfortable feeling when we realize that perhaps some central memories of our history never happened the way we believe them to. This discomfort is natural, because memory is deeply linked to identity. Questioning a memory is almost like questioning who you are. That's why false memories are often defended with such conviction. Not because the person is lying, but because, for them, it's real. The brain doesn't differentiate well enough between a lived experience and an imagined experience. There are countless simple examples of this in everyday life. People who swear they remember an object that never existed. A phrase that no one else has heard. An event that, when investigated, proves impossible. And yet, the feeling of certainty remains. The brain prefers to maintain the narrative rather than dismantle it. Admitting that the scene was fabricated creates instability, breaks internal coherence. False memories also arise as a form of protection. The brain can soften difficult experiences, or, conversely, create explanations for emotional pain that was never fully understood. It constructs stories to make sense of what was left unresolved. It's not a conscious error. It's an adaptive mechanism. An effort to maintain the continuity of human experience. The impact of this on decisions is profound. How many choices have you made based on something you believed you had experienced? How many emotional reactions arise automatically because a false memory was activated? The mind reacts to the internal story, not to objective reality. And the more convincing that story, the greater the impact on behavior, mindset, and how you interpret the world. This phenomenon also explains family conflicts, old arguments, and lasting resentments. Two people can remember the same situation in completely incompatible ways. Each defends their version with absolute conviction. There is no deliberate lie. There are different narratives built over time, reinforced by emotions and repetitions. When you begin to perceive the existence of false memories, something transforms internally. A cautious curiosity arises. A closer look at what seems too obvious. You begin to wonder if certain certainties are facts or stories that have taken shape over the years. This doubt doesn't weaken, it matures. This is one of the most striking revelations of this journey. The brain is not merely a recorder of events, but an active creator of narratives. It writes, rewrites, edits, and adapts the story according to the emotional and cognitive needs of the moment. And it does so convincingly that the internal fiction can become indistinguishable from lived reality. And when this perception begins to take hold, an even more delicate and profound question arises. If the brain is capable of creating memories that never existed, how does it decide what to trust? What makes one memory seem more real than another? It is precisely in this direction that this reflection begins to delve deeper. If this part of the conversation provoked that slight discomfort, that kind of feeling that makes us rethink old things, comment below. That makes sense to me. This simple sentence already shows that this journey is truly happening. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because here we enter one of the most subtle and most dangerous points in the workings of the human mind. Certainty. Not certainty based on evidence, but that inner conviction that is almost impossible to shake. That feeling of, I know it was like this. The brain not only creates memories, it creates confidence in them. And this confidence often comes not from accuracy but from familiarity. The human brain is wired to recognize patterns. That which appears repeatedly, sounds familiar, and fits into existing narratives, comes to be treated as reliable. Familiarity becomes synonymous with truth. If something seems familiar, the brain understands that it has already been validated, that it has already undergone some kind of checking. But this checking, most of the time, never actually happened. When a memory is accessed multiple times, it becomes more fluid. It emerges more easily with less mental effort. And this fluidity creates a very strong subjective feeling. The feeling of certainty. The brain interprets ease of access as a sign of authenticity. If it came quickly, if it came clearly, if it came accompanied by emotion, then it must be real. This is a powerful cognitive shortcut, and a profoundly deceptive one. The problem is that familiarity doesn't distinguish origin. The brain doesn't ask if that memory came from a real experience, a story told, an old imagination, or an interpretation created later. If the content is there, well integrated, coherent with the internal narrative, it receives the label of truth. Trust is born not from the fact but from the fit. That's why some memories seem indisputable. You might even hear different versions, see contradictory records, but internally something resists. It doesn't just seem like a divergence of information, it seems like an attack on perception itself. This happens because memory isn't felt as external data, but as part of identity. Questioning it generates discomfort, instability, almost an internal threat. This illusion of trust has a direct impact on how we make decisions. How many choices are made based on memories that have always been there? How many emotional reactions arise automatically because something sounds familiar, even if the current context is completely different? The brain reacts to the feeling of truth, not to the verification of truth. This mechanism also explains why discussions about the past are often so intense. Each person is not only defending one version of the facts, but also their own confidence in their memory. To abandon this would mean admitting that something fundamental might be wrong. And the brain avoids this kind of shock whenever possible. Behind the scenes, what happens is simple and unsettling. The more a memory is accessed, the more it is reinforced. The more it is reinforced, the more familiar it becomes. The more familiar, the more true it seems. This cycle feeds back on itself. And at no point does the brain pause to ask if that memory was reconstructed, distorted, or even created. It only evaluates how right it sounds. This subjective trust shapes entire mindsets. Deep beliefs about people, about oneself, about the world, are often supported by memories that have never been questioned. The feeling of truth underpins decisions, career paths, relationships, breakups, and repetitions of patterns. All of this is based on internal stories that seem solid, but which may have been built up little by little. The most curious thing is that this certainty tends to increase over time, not decrease. Contrary to what we imagine, old memories don't become weaker simply because they are old. They become more stable in the internal narrative, more integrated, more protected. The brain begins to treat them as pillars. And the longer they go unquestioned, the more true they seem. This is one of the great revelations of this journey. Trust is not proof. Conviction is not accuracy. The human mind confuses ease with truthfulness, familiarity with fidelity to the facts. And it does this because it needs stability. It needs a continuous, coherent story that supports past decisions and gives meaning to the present. When you begin to understand how this works, something shifts in the way you observe your own mind. A more mature curiosity emerges. An inner space that allows you to question without falling apart. You begin to realize that some certainties may not need to be defended so rigidly. That some personal truths can be revisited without destroying who you are. This transformation doesn't happen abruptly. It happens gradually as you begin to distinguish between a feeling of truth and truth itself. The brain continues to use its shortcuts, but now you begin to see them. You start to realize when something seems too real simply because it's too familiar. And when this understanding deepens, an inevitable question arises that completely changes our perspective on memory. If the brain relies so heavily on familiarity, how does it decide what deserves to be remembered so strongly? What makes certain memories gain this almost absolute status within the mind? If this passage made you reflect on any old certainty, write it in the comments. That makes sense to me. This simple sentence already shows that this conversation is going beyond the surface. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because everything said so far ceases to be merely a scientific curiosity the moment it touches real life. When memory mixes with imagination, emotion, and familiarity, the impact is not limited to what happens inside the head. It overflows into decisions, relationships, conflicts, traumas, and choices that shape a person's entire journey. Think about how many important decisions in your life have been influenced by memories from the past. Professional, emotional, and family decisions. Many of them weren't made solely based on what was happening at that moment, but on what you believed you had already experienced. Past experiences function as internal maps. The problem is that these maps can be drawn based on reconstructed, distorted, or even partially invented memories. A negative memory that is misinterpreted can generate a fear of trying again. An emotionally intense experience can become a permanent warning sign. The brain starts saying this didn't work before, or this always ends like this, even when the current context is completely different. The decision doesn't stem from the present, but from the internal narrative created from the past. And this narrative is often not questioned. This is directly reflected in discussions and conflicts. How many arguments arise because two people have different memories of the same event? Each defends their version with absolute conviction, feeling that they are being wronged or invalidated. It's not just about disagreement, it's about identity. Each defended memory carries a sense of personal truth. And the more emotional the event, the harder it is to make room for another interpretation. In family relationships, this is even more evident. Old stories are retold for years, gaining increasingly solid versions. A comment made in the past becomes a landmark. Silence becomes abandonment. A mistake becomes a label. And these memories begin to define roles. Who was responsible, who was wronged, who has always been this way. Memory ceases to be just a recollection and becomes an argument. Trauma also plays a profound role in this process. Painful experiences are not frozen in time. They are revisited, reinterpreted, and reconstructed. The emotion associated with the trauma can amplify details, erase others, and create connections that did not originally exist. The brain tries to protect but at the same time keeps the feeling of threat alive. And this emotional memory begins to influence behaviors, reactions, and daily choices, even when the danger no longer exists. In testimonies, this impact becomes even more delicate. People can recount events with absolute conviction, describing scenes in rich detail, even when parts of it don't match the costumes. Not out of bad intentions but because the reconstructed memory rings true. The brain doesn't differentiate well between memory and interpretation when both are accompanied by emotion and familiarity. And this can have serious consequences in the real world. In the workplace, how many decisions are made based on past experiences that have proven something to the person? A boss who has always been unfair, a project that never works, an idea that has gone wrong before. These conclusions often rely on memories that have been generalized, amplified, or misinterpreted. The mindset becomes closed, not because the current reality doesn't allow for change, but because the past seems to speak louder. This impact extends to how you see yourself. Memories of who you were shape beliefs about who you are. An old mistake can become part of your identity. A past criticism can become an internal limitation. A repeated story about you can be incorporated as personal truth. Imagination fills in gaps, emotion reinforces, familiarity validates, and the person begins to live according to a narrative that may never have been entirely fair. What's most unsettling is realizing that all of this happens automatically. The brain doesn't do this to deceive. It does it to maintain coherence, continuity, and a sense of control. It wants to protect the narrative that underpins its past decisions. Questioning old memories often means questioning past choices. And that requires a level of awareness that isn't always comfortable. When this awareness begins to emerge, something transforms. You start to observe automatic reactions more attentively. You begin to realize that not every certainty needs to be defended so rigidly. That not every memory needs to be treated as absolute proof. This inner space creates the possibility for dialogue, revision, and even reconciliation, with yourself and with others. This is one of the most impactful revelations on this topic. Understanding how memory works changes the way you deal with the present. You stop reacting only to what you remember and begin to observe how you remember. The journey ceases to be guided by untouchable internal stories and becomes accompanied by greater awareness. And the more this awareness grows, the clearer it becomes to view memory not as a perfect record, but as a living process, influenced by emotions, imagination, and the need for meaning. This does not diminish the human experience, it deepens it. It opens up space for freer choices, more honest relationships, and a mindset less imprisoned by the past. When you start to see this impact in real life, the desire to understand something even more fundamental naturally arises. If memory influences our decisions and relationships so much, what happens when we consciously begin to question its reliability? That's exactly where this conversation starts to become even more revealing. If all of this resonated with your personal experience in any way, leave a comment below. I'm on this journey too. This simple sentence already says a lot about the impact of this reflection so far. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because we've reached a revelation that silently changes how you perceive your own mind. After everything that has been explored, it becomes clearer that the brain doesn't function like a faithful archive, organized into chronological folders, where each memory is stored intact and can be accessed without alteration. The brain functions much more like a narrator. A storyteller who revisits the past not to reproduce it, but to give it meaning. When you look back, what emerges is not the past itself, but a version of it. A narrative constructed over time, adjusted, revised, retold internally countless times. Each memory is like a chapter that has already gone through several edits. Some parts were emphasized, others softened, others simply created so that the story would be coherent. And all this happens without warning, without caption, without a clear distinction between what was lived and what was imagined. The brain tells stories because it needs continuity. It needs a beginning, a middle, and meaning. It doesn't tolerate chaos, ambiguity, or emptiness well. So it organizes the past into a narrative that supports who you believe yourself to be today. Memories cease to be mere records and become explanations. They explain why you made certain decisions, why you avoid certain situations, why you react in a particular way. The narrative provides comfort, even when it's not entirely accurate. This is one of the deepest workings of the human mind. The brain doesn't ask if the story is perfectly true, it asks if it makes emotional and narrative sense. If the answer is yes, the story is kept. If not, it is adjusted. Details are altered, gaps are filled, emotions are redistributed. Imagination comes in as an auxiliary resource, blending with memory to maintain the fluidity of the plot. That's why you often have the feeling that certain memories have always been this way. They seem old, solid, indisputable. But, in practice, they are stories that have been gradually consolidated. Each internal repetition strengthened the narrative. Each associated emotion reinforced the conviction. And, at some point, the line between remembering and telling a story to yourself ceased to be perceptible. This perception has a profound impact on mindset. It invites a silent transformation, to move away from the role of passive reader of one's own history and assume a more conscious position as an observer. Not to deny the past, but to understand how it was internally constructed. This changes how you deal with old guilt, regrets, and rigid certainties. It opens space for more honest revisions. When you understand that the brain is a storyteller, it becomes easier to see why two people tell the same story in such different ways. Each has their own plot, their own filters, their own emotional background. There is no single file being accessed. There are parallel narratives, each making sense within the individual journey of the person experiencing it. This also changes how you look at yourself. Some internal stories that seemed like absolute truths begin to be seen as versions. I've always been like this. This always happens to me. I know exactly how it was. These phrases carry a sense of certainty, but now they can be observed with more curiosity. Where did this story come from? How many times has it been retold? What was left out for it to work? This shift in perspective doesn't invalidate emotions or erase experiences. It merely repositions the role of memory. Instead of being the final judge of the past, it comes to be understood as a creative narrator. An efficient yet flawed narrator. Capable of constructing meaning, but not necessarily absolute fidelity. And recognizing this doesn't weaken identity, it strengthens awareness. Throughout this journey, it becomes evident that many decisions were made not only based on what happened, but based on the story the brain told about what happened. And this directly impacts the present. Questioning the narrative doesn't mean losing your footing, but gaining freedom. Freedom to choose more clearly, to react more consciously, to not be guided solely by old chapters that perhaps no longer need to define the current plot. The brain will continue telling stories. That's part of human nature. The difference is that, from this understanding, you begin to listen to these stories from a different perspective. With more attention. With less rigidity. With openness to perceive when imagination has entered the scene unannounced. And this perception changes everything because it transforms the relationship you have with your own past. When you begin to see memory in this way, an inevitable, almost silent question arises, further deepening this reflection. If the mind is constantly narrating the past, how can we learn to listen to these stories without completely confusing them with reality? It is precisely at this point that this conversation continues to unfold. If this lockdown affected you in any way, write in the comments. That makes sense to me. This simple sentence already shows that this reflection didn't just stay on the surface. If you've made it this far, it's because this conversation truly resonated with you on some level. So, if at any point you found yourself questioning a memory, an old certainty, or the way your mind constructs stories about the past, it's worth sticking around. Subscribing to the channel is simply a way to continue exploring this type of reflection, calmly, deeply, and curiously, always looking at the brain and mind in a more honest way. If you want, leave a comment saying this message was for me. Or, I'm with you until the end. I interpret this as a sign that this exchange truly happened, that this conversation didn't just stay superficial. And if you felt this connection throughout the video, a like helps more than it seems. It's a simple way to show that this type of content is worth continuing to exist. And if you want to delve even deeper into this journey, there's a video over here that complements this topic perfectly. Click and continue reading there.